David Jackson lived the kind of quiet life that most people never notice. Every morning at 6:30, he'd make breakfast for his 16-year-old daughter Maya, pack her lunch, and drive her to school in his old Honda. To his neighbors in the peaceful suburb of Roswell, Georgia, David was just another single dad doing his best after losing his wife to cancer 3 years ago. What they didn't know was that before becoming a widowed father, David had spent 15 years as one of the most elite soldiers in the world. He was a Navy SEAL, the kind of man who could disappear into enemy territory and complete missions that most people only see in movies. But that life was buried now, locked away in a past he rarely talked about. David worked as a security consultant, which sounded boring enough that people stopped asking questions. He helped businesses protect their offices and taught wealthy families how to stay safe. It paid the bills and let him use some of his skills without drawing attention. Most importantly, it gave him flexible hours to be the father Maya needed. Maya was everything to David. She had her mother's bright smile and stubborn streak, but she'd inherited David's sharp eyes and quick thinking. She played soccer, got good grades, and had a close group of friends. David had worked hard to give her a normal teenage life, the kind he'd never had growing up in foster care. On this particular Friday evening in October, Maya was excited about a party at her friend Jessica's house. Jessica's father, Robert Hayes, was a successful software developer who'd made millions from a tech startup. The Hayes family lived in Buckhead, Atlanta's wealthiest neighborhood, in a mansion with more rooms than most hotels. "Dad, you know Jessica's family is loaded, right?" Maya said as David drove her to the party. "Their house has a movie theater and an indoor pool." David smiled. "Just remember what I taught you about being aware of your surroundings, okay? And text me if you need anything." "I will," Maya promised, kissing his cheek before getting out of the car. David watched her walk up to the massive front door, where other teenagers were already gathering. Something felt off, but he couldn't put his finger on what it was. As a SEAL, he'd learned to trust his instincts, but as a father, he didn't want to be overprotective. What David didn't know was that his daughter and her friends had been watched for weeks. 3 blocks away, in a rented van with tinted windows, 4 people sat monitoring the Hayes house through advanced surveillance equipment. The leader was a man named Viktor Kozlov, a former Russian intelligence officer who now ran the most sophisticated kidnapping operation on the East Coast. Viktor was in his 40s, thin and precise, with cold gray eyes that missed nothing. "The Hayes girl just arrived," said his partner Elena, a tech specialist who could hack into any security system. "That makes 7 targets inside." Viktor nodded. They'd been planning this operation for 2 months, studying the families, learning their routines, and identifying the perfect opportunity. Robert Hayes was out of town on business, and his wife was visiting her sister in Florida. The teenagers thought they had the mansion to themselves, but they were wrong. "Remember," Viktor said to his team, "we take only the 3 primary targets: Hayes girl, the Brooks boy, and the Jackson girl. Their families have the most money and the least security awareness." Dmitri, a massive man with arms covered in military tattoos, cracked his knuckles. "What about the others?" "We leave them unharmed but scared. Fear keeps people quiet," Viktor replied. He'd run dozens of operations like this across 3 countries. Rich families paid quickly to get their children back, and if you were professional about it, nobody got seriously hurt. The 4th member of their team was Carlos, a local man who knew Atlanta's streets like the back of his hand. He'd been watching the families for weeks, noting their habits and weaknesses. "The Jackson girl's father lives alone with her," he reported. "Single dad, drives an old car, works some kind of consulting job. Probably makes $50,000 a year, at most." Viktor made a note on his tablet. The Jackson family would get the smallest ransom demand, maybe $500,000. The other families could afford much more. Inside the Hayes mansion, Maya and 20 other teenagers were having the kind of party that every high school student dreams about. The music was loud, the pizza was endless, and nobody was worried about. Parents coming home early. Jessica Hayes was the perfect host, making sure everyone felt welcome in her family's incredible home. Maya was in the kitchen with her best friend Chloe when the lights suddenly went out. "Power's probably overloaded," Jessica called out over the confused voices of her friends. "My dad always says the house uses too much electricity." But Maya felt that same strange feeling her father had experienced earlier. Something wasn't right. She'd grown up listening to her father's stories about staying alert, about trusting your gut when things felt wrong. The timing was too perfect, too convenient. Outside, Victor's team moved with military precision. Elena had cut the power and disabled the security system using equipment that cost more than most people's cars. Dimitri and Carlos approached from the back of the house while Victor watched from the front, coordinating everything through encrypted radio headsets. The teenagers were laughing and using their phone flashlights when the back door burst open. 3 figures in dark clothing and ski masks rushed into the house, moving fast and purposefully through rooms they'd already memorized from stolen security footage. "Nobody move, and nobody gets hurt," Victor announced, his voice calm and professional. "We're here for 3 specific people. Everyone else sits down and stays quiet." Panic erupted. Some teenagers screamed, others tried to run, but the kidnappers had blocked the exits. Dimitri was huge and intimidating, but he didn't hurt anyone who cooperated. This wasn't about violence, it was about business. "Jessica Hayes," Victor called, out, reading from a list. "Thomas Brooks, Maya Jackson." Maya's blood turned cold when she heard her name. This wasn't random, they'd come here specifically for her. But why? Her family didn't have money like the others. Jessica was crying as Dimitri gently but firmly guided her toward the door. Thomas, a tall athlete who usually acted tough, was shaking as Carlos grabbed his arm. Maya tried to think of what her father would do, but her mind was racing with fear. "Please," she said to Victor. "My dad doesn't have a lot of money. I think you made a mistake." Victor looked at her with those cold, gray eyes. "Your father will find a way," he said. "Parents always do." The 3 teenagers were led outside to a waiting van with no windows and fake license plates. The whole operation took less than 4 minutes. As they drove away, Maya tried to memorize every turn, every sound, every detail her father had taught her to notice. She didn't know about his military background, but she'd absorbed his lessons about staying calm under pressure. Back at the Hayes house, the remaining teenagers were told to wait exactly 1 hour before calling anyone. By then, the kidnappers would be long gone, and the parents would receive phone calls that would change their lives forever. David was reading in his living room when his phone rang at 2:17 a.m. The caller ID showed an unknown number, which immediately put him on alert. "Hello?" he answered. "David Jackson?" The voice was calm, professional, with a slight accent David couldn't place. "Who is this?" "We have your daughter. She's safe, but that depends on you following instructions exactly. $500,000. You have 48 hours. David's training kicked in instantly. He stayed calm, tried to keep the voice talking, listened for background noise that might give him clues. But the caller was smart. "If you contact police or FBI, Maya dies. If you tell anyone about this call, Maya dies. If you try to find her, Maya dies. $500,000 and she comes home. Do you understand?" "I understand," David said, his voice steady despite the storm building inside him. "But I need proof she's alive." The line went dead. David sat in his chair for exactly 10 seconds, processing what had just happened. Then he stood up, walked to his basement, and began preparing for war. The kidnappers had made one critical mistake. They'd researched David, Jackson, the single father and security consultant. They had no idea they'd just threatened the daughter of a man trained to kill enemies of the United States in 12 different ways. Maya was about to discover that her quiet, gentle father had Secrets that would change everything. David Jackson didn't sleep for the rest of the night. While other parents in his situation would be panicking or calling the police, David was thinking like a soldier again. He sat at his kitchen table with a cup of coffee, making lists and drawing, connections that most people would never see. The kidnappers had made their first mistake by calling him. The phone number was probably untraceable, but David knew people who could dig deeper. The voice had a slight Eastern European accent, probably Russian or Ukrainian. The man was calm, professional, which meant this wasn't his first operation. Most importantly, they'd asked for exactly $500,000, which suggested they'd researched his finances and thought he was an easy target. David walked down to his basement past the exercise equipment and storage boxes that made. It looked like any other suburban father's workshop. But behind a false wall that even Maya didn't know about, David kept the tools of his former life. Advanced surveillance equipment that most police departments couldn't afford. Encrypted communication devices that could reach former teammates anywhere in the world, and weapons that he hoped he'd never have to use again. His first call went to Jake Rodriguez, a former SEAL who now worked for a private intelligence company in Washington. Jake answered on the second ring, despite it being 4 a.m. "David, what's wrong?" Jake knew David well enough to realize he wouldn't call at this hour unless it was life or death. "They took Maya," David said simply. There was a pause. "Who's they?" "Professional kidnappers. Eastern European accent, asking for $500,000. David kept his voice steady, but Jake could hear the controlled fury underneath. "Jesus, what do you need?" "Phone trace, background checks on anyone who's been watching my neighborhood, and access to city surveillance cameras from last night." "Give me 2 hours," Jake said. "David, we're going to get her back." David's second call went to Lisa Chen, a cybersecurity expert who'd helped him transition from military to civilian life. She worked for the NSA but did consulting work on the side. Lisa had always told David to call if he ever needed a favor. "Someone took Maya," he told her. "I need digital forensics on a phone number." Lisa didn't ask questions. "Send me everything you have. I'll start running traces now." While his contacts got to work, David drove to the Hayes mansion in Buckhead. The police were already there, interviewing the teenagers who'd been at the party. David parked across the street and watched, studying the scene like he'd studied enemy positions in Afghanistan. The kidnappers had been smart. They'd waited until the parents were out of town, struck when the security system was most vulnerable, and chosen their timing perfectly. But David's trained eye caught details the police were missing. Tire tracks in the mud showed they'd used at least 2 vehicles. The way they'd cut the power suggested military or intelligence training. And they'd taken exactly 3 kids from families with different financial backgrounds, which meant this was part of a larger operation. David approached. Detective Patricia Williams, who was coordinating the scene. He'd met her once before at a community safety meeting. "Detective Williams, I'm David Jackson, Maya's father." Patricia looked up from her notebook. "Mr. Jackson, I'm so sorry about your daughter. We're going to find her. Have you found any patterns with the other kidnappings?" David asked carefully. "What other kidnappings?" Patricia frowned. "This is the first we've heard about any coordinated effort." David realized the police were treating this as 3 separate cases instead of one connected operation. The Hayes family, the Brooks family, and mine. The kidnappers knew exactly who they wanted. That suggests surveillance, planning, and coordination. Patricia studied David more carefully. There was something about the way he analyzed the scene, the questions he asked, that suggested more than just a worried father. "What kind of work did you say you do?" "Security consulting," David replied. It wasn't technically a lie. Meanwhile, 20 miles away in an abandoned warehouse near the airport, Maya was trying to stay calm while gathering information. The building smelled like motor oil and rust, with high windows that let in gray morning light. She and the other 2 teenagers were being held in what used to be an office space with sleeping bags on the floor and a portable bathroom behind a curtain. Victor Kozlov was pleased with how smoothly the operation had gone. The Hayes and Brooks families had already received their ransom demands, $5 million and $3 million, respectively. The Jackson girl's father would get his call later in the day, once Victor was sure the man understood the seriousness of the situation. The rich families always pay quickly, Victor told Elena as they monitored police radio frequencies. They have lawyers and fixers who know how to move money without getting caught. The Jackson man might take longer, but $500,000 is nothing compared to what we're getting from the others. Elena was tracking news coverage on her laptop. Local TV is already reporting the kidnappings. FBI will probably get involved soon. Let them, Victor shrugged. By the time they figure out where we are, we'll be gone. Maya had been listening to every conversation she could hear through the thin walls. Her captors spoke in English most of the time, but occasionally switched to what sounded like Russian. She'd counted at least 4 different voices, including one woman. The man who seemed to be in charge had called someone about money transfers and mentioned the usual account in the Caymans. What worried Maya most was that they seemed very confident about not getting caught. These weren't desperate criminals making it up as they went along. They had a plan, resources, and experience. But Maya had something they didn't know about: her father's training in how to observe and survive. David's phone buzzed with a text from Jake. "Got something? Call me." The phone number traces to a prepaid cell bought with cash 3 weeks ago, Jake reported. But I pulled traffic camera footage from around the Hayes house. Got partial plates on a dark van leaving the area at 2:15 a.m. Anything else? Yeah, and you're not going to like this. I ran the kidnapping details through our database. Similar operations in Miami, Houston, and Dallas over the past 2 years. Always wealthy families, always professional execution, never caught. David felt his jaw tighten. These weren't amateurs who'd gotten lucky. They were part of an organized network that had been operating successfully for years. Lisa Chen called an hour later with more disturbing news. I traced the digital footprint of your kidnappers. They used the same encrypted messaging system in all 3 cities Jake mentioned. Whoever's running this has serious technical resources. Can you track them in real time? Maybe. They're using military-grade encryption, but they made one mistake. They're running everything through the same server infrastructure. If I can find a way in... David was starting to get a clearer picture of what he was dealing with. Professional kidnappers, probably former military or intelligence, with international connections and years of successful operations. They'd studied his family, planned carefully, and chosen Maya because they thought David Jackson was a soft target. That afternoon, David received his second call from the kidnappers. 40 hours remaining, the same calm voice said. Have you arranged for the money? I'm working on it, David replied. But I need to know Maya is safe. There was a pause, then Maya's voice came on the line. Dad, I'm okay. They haven't hurt me, but I'm scared. Stay strong, sweetheart. I'm going to get you home. Dad, they smell like cigarettes and coffee, and I can hear trains, Maya said quickly before the phone was taken away. The line went dead, but David was smiling for the first time since this started. Maya had just given him 2 crucial pieces of information. His daughter was smart enough to pass along clues about her location, just like he'd taught her during their talks about staying safe. Trains meant they were near railroad tracks. Cigarettes and coffee suggested the kidnappers were getting comfortable, which meant they felt secure in their location. David pulled up a map of Atlanta and began marking every warehouse and industrial building within 5 miles of active railroad lines. As evening approached, David met with Detective Williams again. He'd decided to share some information without revealing his full background. Detective, I think these kidnappers are part of a larger network. They've done this before in other cities. Patricia looked surprised. How do you know that? I have. Contacts in private security who ran the details through their databases, David said carefully. These aren't local criminals. They're organized, professional, and they've been successful because they do their homework. What are you suggesting? That we need to think bigger than just Atlanta. And we need to move fast because if they follow their usual pattern, they'll disappear as soon as they get their money. Patricia studied David again. There was definitely more to this man than he was telling her. Mr. Jackson, if you know something that could help us find these children, I know that Maya is somewhere near active railroad tracks, probably in an industrial area, David said. And I know that every hour we wait, they get more confident about their escape plan. What David didn't tell the detective was that he'd already identified 17 possible locations for the warehouse. Tomorrow morning, he would begin checking each one personally. By Saturday morning, David had narrowed his search to 3 possible locations. Using a combination of satellite imagery, railroad schedules, and industrial property records, he'd identified warehouses that matched Maya's clues about trains and isolation. Each location was large enough to hide vehicles and people, with multiple escape routes that would appeal to professional criminals. David drove past the first warehouse in an old pickup truck he'd borrowed from a neighbor. The building looked abandoned, but fresh tire tracks in the gravel suggested recent activity. More importantly, a freight train passed by every 20 minutes, which matched the background noise he'd heard during Maya's phone call. He parked half a mile away and approached on foot, moving through the woods with the silent precision that had kept him alive in Afghanistan. Through military-grade binoculars, David studied the building for 2 hours, noting guard positions, security cameras, and the dark van parked behind a loading dock. His phone vibrated with a message from Lisa. Chen, found their server. They're planning to move the kids tonight at midnight. Also, Viktor Kozlov is the leader, former Russian military intelligence. David felt a cold satisfaction knowing his enemy's name. Viktor Kozlov had made this personal the moment he took Maya, but now it was also professional. David had faced Russian operatives before, and he knew their training and tactics. Inside the warehouse, Maya was trying to keep Jessica and Thomas calm. Jessica had been crying on and off since yesterday, while Thomas kept pacing and talking about escape plans that would get them all killed. Maya had convinced them to stay quiet and follow her lead, though she couldn't explain why she felt so confident that her father would find them. My dad's going to come for us, Maya told them quietly while their captors were in another room. How can you be sure? Thomas whispered. My parents have way more money than yours. Maybe they'll pay first and get us all released. Maya shook her head. You don't know my father. He doesn't give up on anything important to him. What Maya didn't realize was that her confidence came from 16 years of living with a man who'd been trained never to leave anyone behind. David had instilled that warrior mentality in his daughter without her ever knowing it. Viktor Kozlov was beginning to feel uneasy about the Jackson situation. The other 2 families had already agreed to pay their ransoms with money transfers, scheduled for Sunday night. But David Jackson hadn't responded to their second call, and Victor's local contacts reported unusual activity around potential hideout locations. Someone's been asking questions about warehouse rentals near the railroad, Carlos reported nervously. Industrial area surveillance cameras caught a pickup truck driving past all our backup locations yesterday. Victor studied the grainy photos on Carlos's phone. The truck's driver was careful to avoid showing his face, but there was something about his movements that worried Victor. The man drove like someone conducting reconnaissance, not like a lost civilian. Run deeper background checks on David Jackson, Victor ordered Elena. I want to know everything about this man. Elena's fingers flew across her laptop keyboard, accessing databases that most hackers could never reach. What she found made her blood run cold. Victor, we have a problem. A big problem. What kind of problem? David Jackson isn't just a security consultant. His military records are mostly classified, but I found fragments. Navy SEAL, multiple tours in Afghanistan and Iraq, specialist training in hostage rescue operations. He's not some desperate father. He's a professional killer. Victor felt his confidence evaporate. In 15 years of kidnapping operations, he'd never faced someone with David's training and motivation. How did we miss this? His records are buried deep. Whoever handled his civilian transition did it right. On paper, he looks like any other single dad trying to make ends meet. Victor began calculating new options. They could kill the children and disappear, but that would bring massive law enforcement attention. They could try to negotiate, but a man like David Jackson wouldn't negotiate while his daughter was in danger. Their best option was to complete the money transfers tonight and vanish before David could find them. We move up the timeline, Victor decided. All transfers happen at 8 p.m. tonight, not tomorrow. Then we release the children and disappear. But David was already ahead of them. Using contacts from his SEAL days, he'd acquired night vision equipment, thermal imaging devices, and communication gear that would let him coordinate with Detective Williams without revealing his full capabilities. "Detective, I have reliable intelligence that the kidnappers are planning to move tonight," David told her over the phone. "What kind of intelligence?" Patricia asked. David's information had been accurate so far, but she was starting to suspect. He had resources that most civilians didn't possess. "The kind that saves lives if we act on it quickly," David replied. "I need FBI tactical support at a warehouse near the airport. I'll send you coordinates." Patricia hesitated. "Mr. Jackson, I need to know how you're getting this information. If you're conducting your own investigation..." "Detective, my daughter has been missing for 36 hours. I'm using every resource I have to find her. Right now, we can debate my methods, or we can save 3 children. Your choice." Patricia made her decision. "Send me the coordinates. FBI Tactical will be in position by 6 p.m. As sunset approached, David prepared for what he hoped would be the final phase of his mission. He'd changed into dark clothing and tactical gear, looking more like the Navy SEAL he used to be than the suburban father his neighbors knew. The warehouse was a fortress, but David had breached more secure facilities in hostile territory. Maya sensed the tension among her captors. They were packing equipment, speaking in urgent whispers, and checking weapons more frequently. Something was happening tonight, and Maya doubted it would be good for her, Jessica, and Thomas. "Listen to me," she whispered to the other 2. "When things start happening, stay low and don't run unless I tell you. My dad taught me that panic gets people killed." Jessica looked confused. "What do you mean when things start happening?" Maya couldn't explain the feeling she had, but every instinct told her that rescue was coming. She'd grown up hearing bedtime, stories about heroes who never gave up, never left anyone behind, and always found a way to win. She'd thought those were just stories until now. David approached the warehouse as darkness fell, moving through shadows like a ghost. His thermal imaging showed 4 guards outside and at least 3 people inside with the children. The building had multiple entrances, but only one exit that wouldn't expose the children to crossfire. Through his encrypted radio, David coordinated, with the FBI tactical team positioned around the perimeter. "All units, targets are moving inside the building. Children are in the northeast corner office. 4 adults confirmed, possibly more." "Copy that, Jackson. We're in position." Victor Kozlov was making final preparations when his motion sensors detected movement outside. Multiple contacts approaching from different directions, moving with military precision. His worst fears were confirmed. David Jackson hadn't come. Alone. "We're blown," Victor announced to his team. "Dmitri, watch the children. Elena, start destroying hard drives. Carlos, prep the van for emergency exit." But Victor had underestimated his opponent. David wasn't just coming to rescue Maya. He was coming to end the threat permanently. These kidnappers had terrorized families across multiple states for years, and David intended to make sure they never hurt another child. The assault began at exactly 8:47 p.m. FBI agents breached the main entrance while David entered through a skylight, rappelling down industrial cables with the silence of a predator. Years of retirement fell away as muscle memory and training took control. Inside the office, Maya heard the first sounds of gunfire and shouted to Jessica and Thomas, "Get down and stay down! Cover your heads!" Victor realized he was trapped between the FBI outside and something much more dangerous inside. David Jackson had become the hunter, and Victor's team were now the prey. The final confrontation was about to begin, and Maya was about to see her father as he truly was. The warehouse erupted into chaos as David dropped silently from the skylight into the main floor. Through his night vision goggles, he could see every corner of the building while moving through darkness that would blind his enemies. 15. Years of retirement meant nothing now. Every instinct, every skill, every deadly technique came flooding back, as if he'd never stopped being a Navy SEAL. Viktor Kozlov shouted orders in Russian, trying to coordinate his team's defense, but they were facing something they'd never encountered before. David wasn't just a desperate father or even a regular soldier. He was elite special forces with a personal reason to finish this mission, and that combination made him more dangerous than an entire police unit. Elena was frantically trying to destroy computer equipment when David appeared behind her like a shadow. She reached for her weapon, but David was faster. A precise strike to her wrist sent the gun flying, and a second move left her unconscious but breathing. David had learned long ago that unnecessary killing created more problems than it solved. "Elena's down," David reported through his radio to the FBI team outside, moving toward the children's location. Detective Patricia Williams coordinated the FBI response from outside the building. She'd been skeptical of David Jackson's mysterious resources, but watching him work through thermal imaging, she began to understand exactly what kind of man she'd been dealing with. This wasn't luck or desperation. This was professional military precision applied to a father's mission. Carlos tried to escape through the loading dock, but found FBI agents waiting for him. He surrendered immediately, hands raised, babbling about how this was all Victor's idea and he was just the driver. The federal agents zip-tied his hands and read him his rights while the sounds of combat continued inside the warehouse. Dmitri, the massive enforcer who'd seemed so intimidating to the teenagers, found himself facing David in a narrow hallway. Dmitri was strong and experienced, but David had spent years fighting enemies in close-quarters combat. The fight was brief and decisive. Dmitri ended up unconscious on the concrete floor, alive but completely neutralized. Maya heard her father's voice through the thin walls of their makeshift prison. "Maya, can you hear me?" "Dad," she shouted back, "we're in the office. There's one more man in here with us." Viktor Kozlov realized his operation was collapsing around him. His team was down, the FBI had surrounded the building, and somewhere, in the darkness, David Jackson was hunting him like a ghost. Victor had one card left to play, and he hated himself for even considering it. He burst into the office where Maya, Jessica, and Thomas were huddled together, pointing his weapon at the three teenagers. "Jackson," he called out, "I know you can. Hear me? Back off, or these children die." David's voice came from somewhere in the shadows, calm and steady despite the circumstances. "Viktor Kozlov, former Russian military intelligence. You've been kidnapping children for 3 years across 4 states. Victor spun around, trying to locate David's position, but the voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "How do you know my name?" "I know everything about you, Victor. I know about your operations in Miami, Houston, and Dallas. I know about your offshore accounts and your escape routes. What I want to know is why you thought taking my daughter was a good idea." Maya felt a strange mixture of fear and pride listening to her father. This wasn't the gentleman who made her breakfast every morning and helped with homework. This was someone else entirely, someone who spoke with absolute authority and complete confidence. For the first time, Maya began to understand that her father had secrets she'd never imagined. "Stay back," Victor shouted, pressing the gun against Maya's head. "I'll kill her." "No, you won't," David replied, and suddenly he was standing in the doorway, hands empty, but somehow more intimidating than any armed man Victor had ever faced. "Because you're a professional, Victor. You don't kill children. It's bad for business, and it brings too much attention. That's why you've been successful for so long." Victor kept the weapon aimed at Maya, but his hand was shaking now. Something about David Jackson's presence filled the room with a cold, deadly certainty that made Victor's blood freeze. "I'll do it! I'll kill all three of them!" "Look at me, Victor," David said, taking one step closer. "Really look at me. What do you see?" Despite himself, Victor found his eyes drawn to David's face. What he saw there was worse than anger or rage. He saw the complete absence of fear, the kind of calm that comes from a man who has killed enemies of his country and slept peacefully afterward. Victor was staring into the eyes of a predator who had decided that Victor Kozlov was not going to leave this warehouse alive. "You see it now, don't you?" David continued, taking another step. "You've made the biggest mistake of your criminal career. You didn't kidnap some businessman's daughter. You took a child from someone who was trained to find people like you and eliminate them." Maya watched her father move closer and finally understood why she'd always felt so safe with him, why bullies at school never bothered her twice, why strangers who might have caused trouble always seemed to change their minds when David was around. Her quiet, gentle father was also the most dangerous man she'd ever met. Victor's resolve cracked. "The money! We can split everything. $7 million. We can share it." "I don't want your money, Victor. I want my daughter back, and I want to make sure you never threaten another family." The final moment came when Victor made his last desperate move. He spun the weapon toward David, thinking he could end the threat and regain control. But David had been waiting for exactly this moment. In one fluid motion, he disarmed Victor and left him unconscious on the floor, never once endangering the children. The whole confrontation was over in seconds. One moment Victor was holding them hostage, and the next he was lying motionless while David knelt beside Maya, checking her for injuries with gentle hands that had just neutralized a dangerous criminal. "Are you hurt, sweetheart?" David asked, his voice returning to the warm tone Maya knew so well. "No, Dad. I'm okay," Maya whispered, throwing her arms around him. "I knew you'd come for us." FBI agents flooded into the warehouse, securing the scene and arresting the surviving kidnappers. Detective Williams found David in the office, holding Maya while Jessica and Thomas called their parents with shaking hands. "Mr. Jackson," Patricia said carefully, "we need to talk about exactly what happened here tonight." David looked up at her, still holding his daughter. "What happened is that 3 children are going home to their families, and a kidnapping network that's been operating for years is finally shut down." Patricia nodded slowly. She suspected there was much more to David Jackson's story, but sometimes the important thing wasn't getting all the answers. Sometimes it was just making sure the right people went home safe. Over the next few days, the full scope of Victor's operation became clear. FBI computers contained evidence of dozens of kidnappings across multiple states, millions of dollars in ransom payments, and connections to international criminal networks. The 3 men were charged with federal crimes that would keep them in prison for the rest of their lives. Maya struggled at first with what she'd learned about her father. The gentle man who'd raised her was also someone capable of things she'd only seen in movies. But as they talked in the days following her rescue, Maya began to understand that both versions of David Jackson were real, and both were part of why she'd always felt so protected. "Dad," she asked one evening as they sat on their back porch, "why didn't you ever tell me about your military service?" David was quiet for a long moment. "Because I wanted you to grow up knowing peace, not war. I wanted you to see the world as a place where problems are solved with words and kindness, not violence. But sometimes violence is necessary," Maya said, "like when bad people threaten innocent families." David smiled sadly. "Sometimes it is. But I never wanted that to be your first choice, the way it became mine. Maya leaned against her father's shoulder. I'm proud of you, Dad, for everything you did to protect people, and for everything you do to protect me. A month later, Maya returned to school with a new understanding of her place in the world. She'd inherited her father's strength and courage, but also his wisdom about when to use those gifts. Her friends noticed that she seemed more confident, more aware of her surroundings, but also more kind to people who seemed lost or afraid. David went back to his quiet life as a security consultant, but now Maya understood why his clients trusted him so completely. She also understood why their house had better security systems than most businesses, and why her father had taught her so many lessons about staying alert and trusting her instincts.